Well, it's good to be here with you this morning. I'm going to talk this morning about origins, in particular, human origins, our origins. And I call my talk Origins by the Book, because as you'll see as we go through this, books can have quite a significant impact on what people believe about human origins. And you'll see that it's capitalized there because there's one book that's very significant with respect to this question of human origins. That would be the book that describes creation, which is one of the two accounts of our origins that I think are probably front and foremost competing for people's minds these days. The other one, of course, would be evolution. And as I mentioned, Genesis, the first book in this book, is the one that provides the account of the creation origin. And while there are a lot of books that have been written about evolution, probably the one that everybody immediately thinks about may even qualify as the Bible for evolution would be the book that Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species. Now, these two books contain two quite different accounts of our origins, and so I think that naturally prompts the question, which one is right? They're so different, they can't both be right. Some people think that science has proved that evolution is right. Is that right? And then there are those who wonder how anyone in their claims to be in their right mind, could actually believe the biblical account of origins. And some people question whether or not it even matters, because after all, isn't the gospel the important part of Christianity? Now, I will hope to talk to answer all of these questions this morning, but I want to start by telling you a story about this man. You might recognize him. He's an author. He wrote several stories. Several of those got made into movies, and one of those caused quite a stir in the church. In particular, that particular story was based on this painting by this artist, and the movie starred this actor. So the movie is the Da Vinci Code, or the story is the Da Vinci Code, which would make this guy Dan Brown. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Da Vinci Code, but I would like to talk about something Dan Brown said in an interview that he gave with a trade magazine around about the time the movie came out. He said, "I was raised Episcopalian, and I was very religious as a kid. Then in the 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, 'I don't get it.' I read a book." Now see, there's the impact of books. "That said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang. But here," and by that he meant the other book, the Bible, "it says God created heaven and earth in 7 days. Which is right?" Well, I hope you've all recognized that neither is right? Because God created heaven and the earth in 6 days. Unfortunately, the response I got, he said, was, "Nice boys, don't ask that question." A light went off and I said, "The Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me," and I just gravitated away from religion. Now, this incident illustrates a couple of things. One, many things actually, but two I'd like to highlight. One is that what someone believes about human origins can have a significant impact on how they live their life and where they spend eternity. Equally important, maybe even more important, is how we answer people's questions about human origins can have a significant impact on how they live their lives and where they spend eternity. All right, hope we're all agreed that this answer that Dan Brown got isn't very good, but there are some other answers that are often used, which, while they sound a little bit better on the surface, really are the same sort of brush-off. Things like, "Oh, don't worry about that, just love Jesus," or "That's just a side issue. It's the gospel that's important." Well, clearly the gospel and loving Jesus are both important parts of Christianity, but in fact, the gospel was necessary and has its foundations in what happened in Genesis. Here's one expression of the gospel, verse in John that we're all very familiar with, and here's the connection to Genesis. And here, of course, is the promise of the gospel. And Paul explains this connection in 1 Corinthians when he says, "For since by a man," that would be a real man, "came death," that's the perishing part of the gospel, "by another real man came also resurrection from the dead. For as in Adam all die." So there he makes the direct connection of the perishing part of the gospel back to this real man, Adam, and the real events in the Garden of Eden. And then goes on to explain the promise that also in Christ will all be made alive. And in case we didn't get it there, he says it in Romans again, somewhat differently. He says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men." So, according to the biblical account of our origins, after the 6 days of creation, we wind up with this situation. We have Adam and Eve and all of the animals living together in peace and harmony in the Garden of Eden. And God looked at that, and he declared it to be very good. Up until this point, it had been good, but now that mankind was here and everything was complete, it's very good. But the evolutionary account of our origins is quite different. In it, mankind doesn't appear on the scene until after millions of years of death and disease and pain and suffering that are recorded in the fossil record. Clearly, everything in the fossil record is dead, and if we look at the fossils, we find instances of things like bone cancer. Now, if we try and marry this into the biblical account of origin somehow, that means that when mankind appeared and God declared the finished creation to be very good, that would mean he would think things like bone cancer and death are very good. And that is just not right. All right, let's now go back to Dan Brown's question. He said, I read a book. I don't know what the book was. He didn't say. It might have been National Geographic, which I picked, because it's full of evolutionary propaganda. Could have been Scientific American. It's also full of evolutionary propaganda, and it's actually the one that turned me into an atheist when I went off to university. Of course, these days, people don't actually read books, right? They watch television instead. So it could be television programs like the ones you see on PBS and Discovery Channel, which are full of evolutionary propaganda. He said he read this book, and it said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang. Now, what he didn't say explicitly, but implied by using that expression, the Big Bang, is that the universe happened by chance in an instant about 14 billion years ago. But then he said here, in the Bible, it says that the universe was created by God over 6 days about 6,000 years ago. Now, I know the Bible doesn't say 6,000 years ago, but if you work through it in a logical fashion, that's the answer you get. If you look through all the chronogenealogies, Adam lived to be 130, had Seth, and Seth lived to be whatever, and had this. You work through all of that, the answer you get is about 6,000 years, give or take a bit. All right, he asked his question from the point of view of astronomy and cosmology. Excuse me. Because that was the nature of the book he read. Somebody else might read a book on geology. They might ask the question a different way. They might say, I read a book on geology. It tells me that the geological features of the Earth are the result of slow and gradual local deposition and erosion over billions of years. But here in the Bible, it says that the geological features of the Earth are the result of a catastrophic global flood that happened about 4,500 years ago. Somebody else might be really interested in fossils. So they would read a different book and ask the question differently, like this. I read a book, and it says that life started by accident, and that all of life has descended from a common ancestor over billions of years. But here in the Bible, it tells us that life was created by God, each after its own kind, about 6,000 years ago. And then there might be somebody who's interested in biology or genetics. Their question might sound like this. I read a book on biology, and it tells us that men and ape have descended from a common ancestor over 3.5 million years, or maybe it's 6 million years, because that number does tend to change a bit. But here in the Bible, it tells us that mankind was created in the image of God, not the image of an ape, about 6,000 years ago. So which is right? Well, before I try and answer these, I'd like to ask another question. And I don't ask this question to be confrontational or argumentative, but maybe to get you to think about this issue a little bit differently than you might have in the past. Would you be able to answer these questions? If the next Dan Brown came up to you and asked you one of these questions, would you be able to give him or her a scientifically sound, Bible-affirming answer? Because think of how things might be different today if that minister had been able to do that for Mr. Brown. Rather than gravitating away from religion, think of the stories he might have written, and the movies that might have been made of the stories, and the millions of people who might have seen those movies, and how might the world be different because of that. Now, of course, and never mind the next Dan Brown, what about your children or your grandchildren? If they're in the public school system, they're being taught that evolution is a fact. And if they haven't actually asked you any of these questions yet, you might like to initiate that discussion yourself. Now, of course, to answer these questions, you need to have the information. You need to be equipped with the information that allows you to formulate the answers. And that's actually what Creation Ministries is all about. It's equipping you with the information you need to be able to give scientifically sound, Bible-affirming answers to these sorts of questions. And we have a number of mechanisms for doing that. One of them is a website. It gives you access to over 10,000 articles that have been written on this topic over the last several decades. A new one is featured on the website every day, and you can see that. That's highlighted at the top. This one has to do with DNA that's been found in dinosaur bones, and we'll talk about that later this afternoon. So if you want to sort of get equipped, a good way to do it is to make this website the homepage on your web browser. So when you launch your web browser, the first thing every day, you'll go directly to this website. You can see what the article of the day is, and if it's of interest to you, you can read it. It's a great way to spend the first 10 or 15 minutes of your time on your computer. Of course, to do that, you need to know what the website address is, right? And I always ask at this point, are there people in the audience who already go to the Creation Ministries website? There's one over here. Oh boy, there's another one over here. So we have two resident experts. So if you forget this address, you can go and ask them, because it's really hard to remember. Okay. Now, another way we have of getting information into your hands is a free email newsletter. It's called InfoBytes. It looks like this. Shows up in your inbox every now and again, and it highlights a number of articles that have appeared on the website recently that you might be interested in, gives you a couple of sentences, tells you what it's about, and then a link that you can click on, and you can go directly and read that article. And if you'd like to sign up for this free, I emphasize that, it's free email newsletter, I'm going to ask the ushers to distribute the clipboards, and they'll have a form on it like this, and if you will just give us your name and your email address and your postal code. Go ahead, guys. Get them going, and then pass this on to the next the next person, because we need to get these clipboards back again and do this again later on for something else. Now, I know I'm from Ontario, but I really do know that we don't need your postal code to send you an email. But we like to get your postal code, because if there's another CMI event near you, and we can figure that out from the postal code, we can send you an email and let you know what's going to happen. All right, creation or evolution, which is right? Well, the big move today is to make data-driven decisions, right? So what do the data say? Well, here's some data. What do they say? Listen carefully. Do you hear them speaking? No, you see, contrary to popular opinion, data don't actually speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. To interpret the data, you need an interpretive framework. Here's the interpretive framework for these data. They're part of a 3-country survey on people's beliefs about human origins. The 3 countries are the US, the UK, and Canada. These are the Canadian results. I'm not going to talk about them in any detail, other than to use them to illustrate that once you know what the interpretive framework is for data, you can indeed extract interesting pieces of information. For example, these 2 numbers tell us what? The Canadian women are wiser than Canadian men. And these 3 numbers tell us that older Canadians are wiser than younger Canadians. So if you put those 2 things together, it's logical to conclude that the wisest Canadians are the older women. Amen, guys? Okay. I mean, it stands to reason, right? Our mothers were older than us, and they knew everything. Okay. All right. Data don't speak for themselves. They need to be interpreted. For that, you need an interpretive framework. The nature of that framework will depend on things called presuppositions. They're things that are just presupposed to be true. Not proven to be true, they're just assumed to be true. An example of this at work is in a courtroom. In a courtroom, we have one set of data. It's called the evidence. But we have 2 interpretations based on 2 different presuppositions. One interpretation is based on the presupposition the defendant is innocent. The other interpretation is based on the presupposition the defendant is guilty. And what the jury is supposed to do is carefully examine the evidence, listen to these interpretations, decide which one best explains the evidence, and therefore which underlying presupposition is most likely correct. And you know, that works really well in this question of creation or evolution. Now, the evidence in creation-evolution debate is, generally speaking, scientific. That's what people like to focus on. Since that's the case, we need to understand that not everything that gets called science is the same. We like to divide it into two parts. One is what we call operational science, and the other is historical science. Operational science is the study of how the universe operates. It's the kind of science we learned in high school. It's all about verifying things by doing repeated experimentation. It's all about what we can actually see and measure. Historical science is the kind of science that got popularized by shows like CSI. It's about something that happened in the past. And because of that, it's a one-off event that's over and done with. You can't do any verification by repeated experimentation. If you're investigating a murder, trying to figure out how it happened, it's not good to go around killing more people. In actual fact, what the forensic scientist does is construct a story about the past, which of course makes it history, and what that history tries to do is explain what it is we can currently see and measure. But in constructing that story, it's necessary to do a lot of speculation. And the nature of that speculation will depend on the presuppositions of the speculator. Now, these presuppositions have really significant impact on the conclusions that people reach. And I like to illustrate that using the 747, and in particular, the origin of the 747. Now, I know we all know how the 747 came to be, but let's assume that we don't, right? So I'm going to look at three options. There was a mathematician who once said that the probability that life happened by accident, it's about the same as the probability that a tornado would go through a junkyard and leave a 747. Okay? Now, a fundamental part of the theory of evolution is that life did indeed happen by accident. So if it's okay for evolution, I guess it's okay for the 747. But if you think it's a bit strange to do it all at once, a bit of a stretch, then let's do it slowly and gradually over a long period of time. So a tornado goes through a junkyard, leaves a simple part of the 747. Let's just say the undercarriage. Then after some period of time, maybe a few million years, another tornado comes along, goes through the same junkyard, and adds a bit of complexity. And the story is so, if we wait long enough, at least this is the story with respect to evolution, if we wait long enough, we'll get the 747. But there is in fact a third option. In that one, some engineers do some design work, create a set of design specifications. Then some more engineers do some more design work and design a set of processes by which you can make the 747. And some more engineers do some more design work and design and build a factory in which you can implement those processes. And last but not least, a whole bunch of people go into the factory and implement the processes. So we have these three options now. Accidentally all at once, accidentally slowly and gradually by increments over a long period of time, and by design. But if someone now says, we must explain everything using only natural processes, that is, the processes that we can see happening in nature, you can't even consider that as a possible explanation for how the 747 came into existence, because it involves things like design and manufacturing that aren't natural processes. So with respect to the 747, if you examine the evidence and develop an explanation for its origins in an interpretive framework that doesn't restrict the answers you're allowed to get, so you're looking at it, if you like, through a lens with no filter, pretty obvious it happened by design. However, if your interpretive framework restricts the answers you're allowed to get to only those that involve natural processes, then you're forced to conclude it happened by accident. Not because that's the right answer, but because that's the only option you have given your presupposition. So these presuppositions are really important. And I submit it's the same thing with creation and evolution. If you look at the evidence, and we all have the same evidence, right? There isn't separate evidence for creation and evolution. There's just evidence, like in a courtroom. It's how it's interpreted that's different. If you interpret it with an interpretive framework that doesn't restrict the answers you're allowed to have, it's pretty obvious it was created. I mean, even the arch evolutionist, anti-Christian atheist guide Sir Richard Dawkins in the UK wrote in one of his books, the study of biology is the study of complex things that look like they were designed for a purpose. Well, maybe, like the 747, they look that way because they were designed for a purpose. But he won't accept that, because he insists that we explain everything, including the origin and diversity of life, using only natural processes. So in effect, he's forced to come up with the explanation like evolution. Like the 747, not because it's true, but simply because that's all his presuppositions allow. All right, let's go back to these list of questions then. Now you can see I have cleverly organized them, so the ones in the left-hand column all have a common factor of time, millions and billions of years. And the ones in the right-hand column all have a factor of time, but it's only a few thousand years. Now, as I pointed out, you don't find the few thousand years in the Bible. So where did they come from? Well, they've been around for a long time, but in recent history, in terms of science, they're generally attributed to this guy. He's a Scot who lived about 100 years before Darwin published his book, and he was an amateur geologist, and he wrote a book on geology in which he said, the past history of our globe must be explained by what we can see, what can be seen to be happening now. Notice this isn't something he derived from the data. He didn't go and look at the geological data and say, this is what I can see in the data. He said, when I go and look at the data, I'm going to interpret the data. It must be explained. I'm going to interpret it this way, using only processes that I can see to be happening now. So how many global floods have we seen recently? None. So what this presupposition does is it precludes explaining the geological features of the Earth as a result of a global flood, because we don't see any global floods. And it doesn't matter how compelling the evidence is, you can't go there. Then he went on and he said, so that's called uniformitarianism. That is, that geological processes have uniformly act the way we see them acting today. Then he went on to say, no powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. Okay, so he's into naturalism. And what this does is it immediately precludes interpreting the geological features of the Earth as having resulted from a global flood that was caused by God. Okay, so the presuppositions here are restricting the answer you're allowed to have. Doesn't matter how clear the evidence is, for that other answer, you can't go there. So it's called naturalistic uniformitarianism. It's really easy to do. If you want to know how long it took to lay down a layer of rock, you measure the thickness of the rock, you find out how fast sediment's being deposited today in the ocean, you do that division in the first line, and you get out how long it must have taken to deposit that layer of rock. Except we had this explosion in Mount St. Helens back in the 1980s that demonstrated pretty clearly that, yeah, this may very well not be correct. Here's a geological feature, a wall of rock that didn't exist before Mount St. Helens erupted. It's actually composed of 3 different layers. The bottom layer is an ash layer. The top layer is a mud layer. But the really interesting layer is this one, because if you look at it closely, it's made up of many, many fine layers. Now, a uniformitarian geologist would probably tell you each one of those layers represents a year of deposition in still water. So as the water sits there, it's got sediment in it. As the temperature changes over the course of the year, the density changes and its ability to hold up sediment changes, so some deposits out. So if you want to know how long it took to deposit that layer of rock, you just count them up. Pretty easy, except it's wrong. Because people watched that being formed, and it took only 3 hours one afternoon when a huge volume of what they call pyroclastic flow, which is gas actually, hot gas, but it was full of sediment, behaves just like water, came flowing very quickly past here horizontally. So it wasn't still at all, and that's what it left. And now they've confirmed, using experiments in flumes, that that's what happens. When you have water full of sediment flowing quickly and horizontally, it tends to deposit rock that looks like that. Here's another feature that didn't exist before Mount St. Helens erupted. They call it the Little Grand Canyon because it's got all the same features as the Big Grand Canyon. It's just smaller. It's 1/40th the scale. And you see there's a small river in the bottom here. The canyon's quite deep. So a uniformitarian geologist would conclude that that little river took a very long time to carve that canyon. Except people watched this canyon being formed in one afternoon. When a huge volume of water that was a result of the explosion, came flowing down this area and carved the canyon. There was no canyon there before. There was no river there before. After the canyon was formed, there was a natural place for water to flow, so that's why there's a river there. So the river didn't cause the canyon, it was the other way around. So it doesn't take a long time to deposit rocks, nor form canyons. It takes the right conditions. A large volume of water flowing quickly. In the case of sedimentation, full of sediment. But how about rocks? Don't rocks take a long time to form? Well, no, they don't. Here's a rock that was found on a beach in Australia by some folks, and since it was different than the other rocks, I guess stone would be a better word for it, they bent over, picked it up, turned it over, and there was a toy car inside. So toy cars haven't been around for, a very long time, so it obviously didn't take a long time for that rock to form. So we have evidence of things, geological features can form quickly. So maybe it's not so ridiculous to consider the possibility of the geological features having been formed by a global flood. But I think that then reads the question, do we have enough water for a global flood? Well, if you were able to be in the space station, you'd get to see the world from this perspective, and it looks like it's all water. And in fact, 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, some of it in trenches that are very deep and very long. And if you were to push those trenches up and push our current mountains down to make a relatively smooth Earth, a guy by the name of Jacques Cousteau calculated that there'd be enough water to make a layer 2.7 kilometers deep all over the Earth. Now, we're told in the Bible that during the flood, the water covered all of the high mountains. So, how high are mountains? Well, I got my PhD at McMaster in Hamilton, and I lived at the foot of Hamilton Mountain. Oh, and incidentally, I lived right next door to the very first Tim Hortons outlet in Canada. Yeah, I saw it. 981 Main Street West was the address of mine, and it was right there beside our apartment building. Google Earth tells me that the top of Hamilton Mountain is only 220 meters above sea level. But they do call it a mountain. I know to you guys that would be pretty silly, but they do call it a mountain in Ontario. I used Google Earth and I found another Hamilton Mountain in Washington State. And I guess because it's an American Hamilton Mountain, it's actually 3 times taller than our Hamilton Mountain. But it's still only 700 meters above sea level at the top. And now I had, I considered it good fortune, you may not consider it good fortune, to have lived in Alberta for a number of years, just west of Calgary, and I could see these mountains from the other side. I could see the Rocky Mountains from our place, and we used to go up there. They're pretty spectacular. We used to go up there to Banff and Lake Louise and Jasper and places like that, and I assume there would be people here who've been there, right? Right, way up there in the mountains, well, they'd all be underwater, with 2.7 kilometers of water on the Earth, which I thought was pretty amazing. But somebody's going to point out, yeah, but how about Mount Everest? Well, you're right. Mount Everest, at its present elevation, would not be covered by 2.7 kilometers of water. But if you look at Mount Everest, you'll find out it's made up of sedimentary rock. That is, rock that was deposited underwater. And if you were to go up there and pick those rocks up, you'd find out they're full of marine fossils. Little itty-bitty critters that don't actually climb mountains. And I've actually done this in the Rockies. I've gone up in the Rockies and picked up those stones, and they're just chock-a-block full of little marine fossils. And you can do this in any of what's called the fold mountains. The Himalayas, the Rockies, the Andes, or the Alps. They're all made of sedimentary rock, and they're all full of marine fossils, which means they were all underwater when that rock was laid down. And actually, creationists and evolutionists agree on that. We just have different explanations of how they got to their present altitudes. Creationists, or the evolutionists, say it took millions and millions of years of slow and gradual plate tectonics to push those things all up from when they were formed. The creationists say, no, it only took a few weeks of catastrophic plate tectonics during the latter stages of the flood, when the rocks were still plastic, like plasticine, and you could push them up relatively easily. So, same evidence, different interpretation based on different presuppositions. All right, so it would appear from the evidence that there might actually have been a global flood, because there's all of this evidence from mountains all around the world that they were underwater. So I think that then gets us to the question of, what about this ark thing? Would there be enough space on the ark for all the animals that have to go on the ark? Well, probably not if the ark looked like this, which is the way we typically draw it, and we typically leave animals off. That would be these guys, the dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs are air-breathing land animals, so they would have been on the ark. Of course, the ark didn't look like that. It looked more like this. We've got specs in the Bible for how big the ark is, and it's kind of this size. If you figure out its capacity, it's got the same capacity as a very long train. Each one of these cars in the train will carry 240 sheep, so it means we can get 125,000 sheep on something the size of the ark. Now, is that enough to hold all of the animals? Well, it depends on two things, right? It depends on how many animals and how big they are. So So let's have a look at that. What has to go on the ark? Well, God told us what was to go on the ark. He was speaking to Noah. He said, "Behold, I am bringing the flood to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life." What do you think he means by the breath of life? Well, earlier on in the creation account, it talks about God creating mankind. He says, "Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." So the breath of life would seem to be related to the manner in which humans breathe with bellows lungs. Back in the other section, God goes on and says, "And of every living thing you, Noah, shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark. They shall be male and female." Now there were 7 pairs of some kinds, but 2 of every kind for now. And then he goes on and he says, "Of the birds after their kind, and of the animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind, will come to you." That's important. God brought the animals to Noah. Noah didn't go and decide which animals to put on the ark. All right, so then let's go back to considering whether or not we've got enough space on the ark. And let's divide our animals into dinosaurs and everybody else, right? Because we have all this vision of dinosaurs as big, many big, huge things, and how are they ever going to fit on the ark? Well, how many kinds of dinosaurs are there? I have no idea, but I did a internet search, and of course, since I found it on the internet, this is obviously correct. I found a website that said these were the kinds of dinosaurs, and there are 15 of them. And they also pointed out that all of these actually belong to the same family, the theropod family. And these guys belong also to the same family, the sauropod family. So if that's the case, there might only be 9 kinds of dinosaurs. Well, fortunately for me, there was a fellow who spent a long time and actually went and researched all of the different classifications of dinosaurs, or all that had been put out. He concluded that there were actually 50 different kinds of dinosaurs. That's quite a bit more than 15, but okay, let's go with it. So that means we got 100 dinosaurs on the ark. What about all the rest of the animals? Well, this is the taxonomical classification system that's used for animal life, or for all life. It was actually developed by a biblical creationist by the name of Linnaeus. And the only ones we have to worry about are the ones in yellow, because they're the only ones with the breath of life. Okay, we don't have to worry about fish, we don't have to worry about eels, we don't have to worry about insects, we don't have to worry about clams and mollusks and all those things. Just the ones with the breath of life. And look, when we get down to the appropriate level, there's the birds, the animals, and the creepy crawly things. Just like we read in the previous chapter, or the previous bit of the Bible. Now, if you look at the numbers of things below that, like the numbers of orders, families, genus, and species for each of these, it looks like this. Right? And if you total all of those up, it looks like this. So now what is a kind? Well, kind has to do with reproduction, right? Things were to reproduce after their kind. Today, we say that a species is something that can reproduce within itself, but not with other species. So maybe that was a kind. If that was the case, then there'd be 25,500 times 2, or roughly 51,000 animals on the ark. However, there's evidence that the kind is actually higher in our taxonomical classification. For example, we have these things called ligers, which are the result of reproduction between lions and tigers. And we have zorses, which are the result of reproduction between zebras and horses. Right? So it would seem that things that we consider to be different species can actually interbreed. And so maybe the family, or the kind, is as high as a family, because that would get us into this place of canines, dogs, cats, and horses. Now, the fellow who did this extensive analysis eventually came to the conclusion that a kind correspond to a genus, in which case he figured that there'd be 16,000 animals on the ark. So now we got 16,000, we got 100 dinosaurs and 16,000 non-dinosaurs. So that's not a very big number now, right? I mean, a lot of people think, well, how can you get all these millions of species that we have on the ark? Well, we don't have to. We only need to get a few animals on the ark. What about the size? Well, let's talk about dinosaurs first, because we all think of dinosaurs as great big things. Dinosaurs start life hatching out of eggs. And one of the largest dinosaur eggs found so far is about the size of an ostrich egg. Hello, an ostrich egg. Now, ostrich eggs are pretty big. They're a lot bigger than hen's eggs, but they're still not that big. So that dinosaur, when it's hatched, wasn't very big. And scientists have looked at the fossil record and come to the conclusion that dinosaurs had a growth habit pretty much like humans. Right? Humans are born small, which is a good thing, right, ladies? They stay small for a number of years. Then they become teenagers. They shoot up, and then they stay adult size. Well, guess what? Dinosaurs did exactly the same thing. Here's what they put together for an Apatosaurus, which is one of those great big huge sauropods. Look how big it is relative to a person when it's an adult. So here's the teenage growth spurt size. Now, thinking back, remember it said, God said he would bring the animals to Noah. So it makes sense that he would bring juveniles, right? Several advantages. They're small, so they don't take up too much space. They're not too heavy yet, so they're not going to sink the ark. They don't need to eat a lot yet, so Noah and his family don't have to pack in a lot of food into the ark. And that has the corollary that they don't produce a lot of manure, which has a lot of spin-off benefits for Noah and his family. Now, if we take that mass of the juvenile Apatosaurus and compare it to the mass of animals that we know today, it'd be about the same size as a horse. So when those Apatosauruses went on the ark, they were probably about the same size as a horse. A whole lot smaller than they were going to be when they became adults. Now, this gentleman that I mentioned who did the feasibility study for the ark, he looked at all of the other animals, and he looked at their growth habits. And it's, I mean, animals all tend to grow the same way, right? We got little tiny kittens that become big cats, and we got little tiny dogs that become big dogs, right? They all do the same thing. And he figured that the size of the animal that would partition the animals on the ark in half in size, that is, 50% would be smaller than that, and 50% would be larger than that, would be something about the size of a rat. You know, so rats aren't very big. So half of those 16,000 animals on the ark were smaller than a rat, and half were larger. Then he figured that about 11% of them would be bigger than a sheep, which is why I picked sheep. I didn't actually pick sheep. He picked sheep, and I was just using his example. And as we've just sorted out, Apatosauruses and Brachiosauruses and those kind of sauropod guys would be like horses. And the other dinosaurs we kind of know, like T-Rex and Stegosaurus and Triceratops, would be about the size of a large dog. Okay, so, that puts a different spin on things, doesn't it? So here's the size that's available in the ark. And we can put 125,280 sheep. Now that isn't actually 125,000. Each one of those sheep represents a few sheep. This number over here is the number of animals that are actually larger than a sheep. And this represents the total number, 16,000 animals that are on the ark. So all of the rest of this place is empty space available for food. This actually, to me, prompted, well, why is the ark so big? Why did God have Noah make such a huge ark when he didn't need all that space for animals? I think it has to do with stability and safety. Right? Naval engineers have studied the dimensions of the ark, and they found out that it's extraordinarily stable configuration in very high sea states. And that's exactly what they need to survive what's going on in the flood. Now, this would then say that immediately after the flood, people and dinosaurs were walking around together on the earth. And there's lots of evidence that that's the case. There's a whole book full of it called Dire Dragons out there, but I'm going to talk about some scientific evidence that has to do with biological tissue that's been found in dinosaur bones. Started in 1994, and there's all kinds of it now, but initially this lady cut a slice of T-Rex bone, put it under her microscope, and she said it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. This is what she saw. She let the other folks in her lab have a look, and one of them finally blurted out, "You've got red blood cells." And indeed, they tested them for hemoglobin, and they turned out to be red blood cells. However, Mary Schweitzer said, of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? Well, they can't. In any event, how does she know the bones are 65 million years old? Anybody been on a dinosaur dig? Find a dinosaur bone? I haven't either, but I have it on reliable authority that when you find the bones, they don't have little tags that say how old they are. The way they figure out the age is they have the bone and they know which rock layer the bone was found in. And the age is described to the dinosaur is the age ascribed to the rock layer based on uniformitarian geology. But if these rock layers were formed as a result of the flood, the dinosaur bones would only be 4,500 years old. Then maybe the survival of this biological tissue begins to make sense. But we're told it takes a long time to make a fossil. The dinosaur dies in the ocean, sinks to the bottom of the ocean, where it lies peacefully on the ocean floor, and the flesh is decomposed and washed away, and over millions of years it is covered up by slow and gradual sedimentation. Then the bottom of the ocean over millions of years is lifted up by slow and gradual uplift, and then there's more millions of years of slow and gradual erosion until the bones are exposed for somebody like Mary Schweitzer to find them. Except when things die in the water, they don't sink. They float. Well, they sink first, then they bloat, and then they float back up again very quickly. So then what happens? Well, all the other things that aren't dead come around and scavenge the flesh. And eventually you're left with just a skeleton, and it falls to the bottom of the ocean, but it doesn't fall down like a nice, contained skeleton like we saw in the previous picture. It falls all over the place. And then the bottom dwellers come out and eat up the bones, or they dissolve in the salt water. Because when you look at the bottom of the ocean, you don't see it littered with fish skeletons waiting to become fossils. There just aren't any. Right? So, what about fossils like this? This is an ichthyosaur. Look at the exquisite preservation. And it was fossilized having birth. Now, one would hope that doesn't take millions of years, right, ladies? I've never done it myself, but I understand it's, kind of difficult. Or this one, having lunch, one fish having another for lunch. I mean, how long can that possibly take? And look at the exquisite preservation. The only way to explain these fossils, and these are typical of the fossils we see, right? The only way to explain this is not slow and gradual sedimentation, it's catastrophic sedimentation. So the fish is swimming along and it's overwhelmed by a fast-flowing undersea current full of sediment. It's trapped, it's protected, the scavengers can't get to it, the flesh decomposes and disappears, and the bones are left as a perfect fossil. You say, but fossils need to become permineralized. Doesn't that take a long time? Well, not really, because here's a fossilized bowler hat, here's a fossilized bag of flour, and here's a fossilized water wheel, none of which have been around for a long time. Like the sedimentation and the canyon formation, it doesn't take a long time, it just takes the right conditions. Now, you see, I've got these pictures from something called Creation Magazine. That's another mechanism we have for getting information into your hands so you'll be equipped to give scientifically sound, Bible-affirming answers. We consider it our number one tool for equipping you with that information. It comes out 4 times a year. It's actually chocker block full of information. The articles range in size from a couple of pages, or a couple of paragraphs to a couple of pages, so they're not hard to read. They don't take a long time. They are scientifically current. We got guys that just monitor the scientific literature and take stuff out and write for the magazine. They're written for scientists, or by scientists, so they are scientifically correct, but they're written for non-scientists, so they're easy to read. There's no paid advertising, so it's all relevant information, and there's always a children's section. Now, we've tried to make this, after some experimentation, to make it as easy to subscribe as possible. We run it like a true subscription series, just like Netflix. So the subscription costs $2.50 a month, but we only collect it every 3 months. So it's $7.50 every 3 months, charged either to your credit card or extracted from your checking account. For that, you get a hard copy sent in the mail. You get access to a digital copy, which you can download onto up to 5 different devices. So if you got a whole bunch of digital natives in the family, each with their own smartphone or whatever, they can all be reading their own issue. If you sign up today, you get the first issue free, plus you'll get a free DVD. To do that, I'm going to ask the ushers to recirculate the clipboards, and they now should have a form on it like this. If you go ahead, guys, just get them going. If you'd like to subscribe, you fill out. Each of these will have a number of forms on them. Fill out the front with the information we need to send it to you in the mail. Fill out the back with the information we need in order to collect the $7.50. Bring it to the back, and we'll get you your free gift. Now, I want to deal with one last thing while you're doing that, and that is this idea that science has proved that evolution is true. What about that? Well, I think when people say that, they're probably thinking of the fossil record. So let's have a look at that. Here's a depiction of the fossil record. Over here, we have all the rock layers. Then we have, in the other part of the picture, an indication of which kind of fossils appear in which rock layers. Here we have plants, here we have animals, here we have corals and sponges, and the dashed lines don't indicate that things are missing. They're simply used to indicate saltwater fossils. Now, a very obvious feature is this. Below that line, there are essentially no fossils. Above that line, there are essentially fossils of everything immediately in the rock layer right above it. That rock layer is called the Cambrian. And this phenomenon is referred to as the Cambrian explosion, because life just explodes out of nowhere in the Cambrian rocks. And evolutionists or paleontologists refer to this. One paleontologist described it this way. All the major groups of life, which we know today, appear in the Cambrian with no evolutionary ancestors. In the rock layers above the Cambrian, no new or different body plans appear. Now, that's not what you would expect from the theory of evolution. You'd expect to see lots and lots and lots of fossils of this thing called the last universal common ancestor. That's the ancestor, the thing that was supposed to be the ancestor of every life form on Earth. So there should be lots of fossils of that. Well, there aren't any. Then what we should see is a whole bunch of transitional forms branching out from this last universal common ancestor to become, in effect, the root of this alleged tree of life that purports to show how all of life is evolved from this last universal common ancestor. But the evidence is there's no root. And in fact, it's not a tree, it's an orchard. Because we have all of these different phyla, body plans, with some variation within the body plans, but no transitions between body plans and no new body plans. Well, that's exactly what you would expect from the biblical account of our origins. All right, here we are back at these questions. We've looked at a little bit of evidence now from geology, which is just what we'd expect from the biblical account, but not so much what we'd expect from the evolutionary account. Similarly, in paleontology, in the fossil evidence. And if we were to look at the other two areas, and we will look at the biology area after lunch, we find exactly the same thing. All of the evidence we see in all the different scientific disciplines is just what we would expect to see if we read Genesis as real history, but not what we would expect to see given the evolutionary account of our origins. Now, I mentioned this one earlier. We need to always be prepared. Oh, no, I didn't. We are instructed in the Bible to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that we have. That's a kind of a passive thing. You wait until somebody asks you a question, then you give them an answer. There's also an active admonition to be able to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, which I submit this evolutionary account of our origins does, because it contradicts God's word in the Bible. Now, to do either of these, you need to have the information in order to formulate the answer or formulate the argument. And I've tried to convey a bit of that information today, and it's only a bit, but we all know what will happen, right? You walk out, you immediately start forgetting things. And a pastor, I got to say this, a pastor at the church I was at yesterday pointed out that by the time you get to day 6, you've forgotten pretty much everything. So it's a really good thing you get to come back to Sunday the next day, or back to church the next day. Now, we also know, we forget stuff, we also know from being in school that if we want to pass the exam, it really helps to review. But to review something, you need to have it, right? To have it to review. You know, place your hands on it, which gets us back to this and why we think it's such a useful tool. Now, if you want to be equipped to answer questions, this would be a good resource. We got lots of resources out there. I'm just going to highlight a couple. This gives the answers to the 60 most frequently asked questions that CMI speakers have had over the decades. In order to demolish arguments, this is an excellent resource because that's exactly what it does. It demolishes all of the areas, the arguments for evolution in all of those particular areas. But in the end, the important thing is to be equipped. Whether you get those resources or some other resources, the important thing is for us to be able to give biblically or scientifically sound, Bible-affirming answers to anybody who happens to ask you, whether it's students at school, whether it's your kids, whether it's your grandchildren, your nieces or nephews, or whatever. So thank you very much for your attention.